Okay. So, like Joel said, I'll be talking a bit more about sort of the practicalities of like organizing and everyday action. From talking to Antti about the sort of the way that student politics works in Finland, and I think Joel talked a bit about this. It seems like you have the main student council that's sort of based on a corporatist model, and then there doesn't seem to be that much autonomous student organizing outside of that. So I also have a question maybe for the discussion. I'd like to know if there is any sort of autonomous student organizing, what kind of form that takes. But maybe we can talk about that later. So my experience with the start was more organizing in an English-speaking university, which was sort of a different political context because some of the French schools have more of a syndicalist tradition and they're kind of more familiar with certain actions such as strikes, whereas the English-speaking schools had more international students and also more students from other parts of Canada. And in my discussion with Will yesterday, we were wondering whether or not there might be some similarities with sort of Nordic societal model of the welfare state and English-speaking Canada, where most people or most university students just kind of trust the government to act in their best interest or in more or less what's best for them. So there isn't this framework necessary to be able to talk about organizing outside the existing structures of student organizing. So one thing that was really useful in Quebec was the fact that each university department had its own student association. So you would be able to call your own general assembly based on each department instead of having to call a general university one or like even a general faculty one. So that made it way easier to kind of get the ball rolling in terms of strike action or political action against the government plans to increase tuition fees. And the way this worked in these sort of settings, like the English-speaking universities where most people were not familiar with strike, was that maybe the more radical departments, like in my school, maybe philosophy or geography, would be the ones to go on strike first, and they would have maybe a 1-week strike with the option of renewing the vote to keep it going for another week. Okay? And then by the second week, maybe the English department would go in, and it sort of picks up, and eventually you're able to have a university-wide general assembly. So I think that's a very important thing to be able to have small units of autonomous organizing, to be able to kind of get things started, and even if just sort of symbolic actions like one-day strikes or certain marches and things like that, or handing out visas, that can grow into bigger things. So the departmental assemblies are very good, very good way of organizing. Another thing that was kind of new for a lot of people in this context was the way in which political dissent took place. So maybe some people had some background that, where they were familiar with like going to protests or marching or things like that, but they were definitely not familiar with picket lines or blockades or any sort of that type of action. So that was also kind of an interesting moment when you started to have, first of all, when you go to school on strike, you have picket lines to discourage students to go into class. So that was kind of the first experience of confrontation, and there was this, internal debate on whether the picket line's purpose should be to stand in front of the classroom and convince students why they should go in and convince them why striking is a worthwhile thing to do. And the other opinion, I guess, was the purpose of the picket line is to physically stop people from coming in, to just be confrontational, and there's no real need to convince scouts, basically. And in my opinion, I found that trying to convince people by talking to them during strike action was actually not the best thing to do. The best thing to do was actually just to say, we're on strike and you have no option but not to stop. And a lot of people would get really angry, but a lot of these people would then actually think about what was at stake, and the next time there's another picket line, something like that, we get more people there. The other thing that we kind of saw was really effective during the strike was these things called manifestation, which was kind of like a mix of two French words, so manifestation and action, which are sort of like demonstration or march and action. And these were all organized very much independently by department groups, or even smaller than that, like people within department groups. And what they were essentially economic blockades, because there had been a series of marches and even one day or 1 week strikes before then, and the government was refusing to even address the issue of tuition fees. So what started to happen was, strike actions like blocking a road, and for these, I mean, the good thing about these kind of actions is you only need 5 people to block the road, and you only need 10 people to shut down the offices of a major bank. You know, like, all you do is stand in front of the door, or stand in front of the car, or stand in the middle of the bridge, or in front of the train, or I don't know, whatever. Maybe not in front of the train, because that might be a decision. But yeah, to the train. And within a week of these kind of things happening, the government was already bringing people into negotiations. And also what that did was, you know, it started with a couple of little things. I think it started with some students after a march just going off and blocking one of the main bridges that went into the city. And within a couple of weeks or a month, there was maybe 2 or 3 different actions every day. So that also overwhelms what the police response can actually be, and it makes all the other actions more effective to get away with things. And I think this kind of model might be more useful in situations where you might not have the support of kind of like the general student body or the general population, and it seems like in Finland this might be the case. So instead of having a march and having some people show up and you march to Parliament and you focus maybe on the news and someone in government reads about it, or I don't know, you make them lose money. And when they start to lose money, they have to pay money. So that's a really good strategy, but also it's also a much more difficult strategy because, you know, immediately you'll have the media attempt to kind of discredit the movement, and other students, you know, talk about how you're taking the school hostage or stopping, you know, like people trying to drive to work, or I don't know, you're ruining their lives. But I would say when this has to happen, not saying that we're doing a good job. What else? Yeah, so the more, part of the successes of the Quebec strike, the actual like people on the ground part of the strike was familiarizing people with confrontation and making people realize that you can get away with much more than you think you can get away with. In the end, I mean, it led to like thousands and thousands of arrests, but the fact was that because they were thousands and thousands of arrests, the government never had like the capability to process them, and the charges were dropped. And most of these charges were kind of made up in the first place, you know. The other good thing was that these kind of more like mobile strike committees started to be forming along the department lines as well. So these would kind of just be like groups of 5, 10, 50 students that were just ready to go do things. And yeah, as the momentum is growing, that it's great to kind of have people, it's very exhausting, so you can have a group of people go do something and then leave, and then another group of people come in. And the other thing is very important to have kind of, these small victories, because as I was discussing with Joel yesterday, you might, it's very difficult and overwhelming to kind of think about how you and your friends are going to, destroy capitalism. And it seems like a very impossible thing to do. But when you have little successes, like you manage to, close a major road for 2 or 3 hours, that feeling of having been able to do that, even though that road isn't going to bring down everything that's wrong with the world, it really gives lots of energy to whatever might come next. If you're doing things, like being an actor, kind of a constant exercise and frustration, you're always doing things and nothing happens. So doing things that might lead to something happening, even if it's something small, are a great way of getting things started and getting more people on board. Let's see. The other thing that I intend in Finland, there's the possibility of maybe switching to for international students being implemented. So I guess the discussion, my question is, I'd like to know what kind of international students there are in Helsinki and in Finland, and is it kind of people that are just there for 6 months or a year, or is it mostly people? Are there lots of international students? Because that might be questions that are important to ask in terms of what can be done to organize. Because you have people that are just there on Erasmus or something like that, it might be more difficult to have to even make compare because they're leaving. So yeah, and maybe I also have some questions about what kind of stuff is being done in Finland around things to do with migrant solidarity and migrant justice, migrant rights, and how maybe that can be linked to this issue of tuition for international students. Because again, one of the things that happened Quebec is that other smaller organizations that had kind of related struggles, but not necessarily the same ones, started to be more involved. And ultimately, even if the strike didn't succeed in achieving what it had set out to achieve, it definitely created a population that was much more involved in related struggles. And I guess, I'm not sure, people might wonder, well, what's the importance of combating something like tuition fees for international students when it might not be that there's that many of them, or that it's really that much of an immediate issue, or that it might have that big of an impact on people's lives. But I guess as most people in the room will probably know, these are kind of the first steps that are taken in an effort to privatize education and corporatize education. So in Quebec, when things happened, there was a threat to raise the tuition fees in 2005. There was a big student strike, and then the government said, okay, well, we'll only raise the tuition fees for people outside of Quebec. And then that kind of seemed to be a good compromise at the time, and then 6 years later, it's raised for everyone. So it's important to keep that in mind, and it's important to keep in mind that these kind of cuts, these implementations of tuition fees come alongside cuts to funding. So if you take money away from education, you start to need to get that money from somewhere else, we get it from international students, we also get it from corporations. And then that's when you have this whole kind of draconian transformation of higher education, where basically the university turns into a place where people get trained, where corporations give money to the university to train their future employees. And you know, years on politics, I can take that up. So, yeah, and I guess another thing that I guess I'd like to know what kind of the more particular obstacles are in the Finnish context with student organizing. But yeah, like I said, from my experience, the best things that we did were smaller level groups like departments, lots of little actions instead of a few big ones, and kind of lots of mutual support, lots of like letting people rest, letting people sleep. All of that is what keeps a movement going. So I think now it's time for Jaakko to give part of the talk, and then maybe we'll have some discussion.